Tessa stood at the podium with her gown brushing against her ankles, her hands steady even though hundreds of faces stared back at her. The hall was silent, the kind of heavy silence that makes people lean forward without realizing it. Behind her, the giant screen flashed her name, valedictorian, Tessa Morgan. In the front row, she saw her parents, Jamie and Susan, sitting proudly beside Carol, who looked confused and irritated at the same time. They had no idea what Tessa held in the small white envelope tucked beneath her speech. They thought she was about to give the usual thank you message. They thought this moment belonged to their favorite daughter. But today Tessa was not here to play the role they wrote for her. Today was the day she stopped being quiet. She looked straight at Carol, who smirked as if the spotlight still belonged to her, like it always did growing up. Carol had told everyone in the family that Tessa barely passed her classes. Jamie repeated the story in front of friends, laughing like it was harmless. Susan nodded along, pretending it was love, pretending she was only teasing. Tessa remembered every comment, every joke, every time they introduced Carol as the brilliant one, and her as the helper who tries her best. She cleared her throat, gripping the microphone gently. "Before I begin," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I want to thank my family for being here." People smiled politely, unaware that the floor was about to tilt beneath the Morgan family. Tessa raised her head and let the silence settle around her again. 3 months earlier, this same family had sat at the dining table in their tidy suburban home, discussing Carol's tuition for her final year. "We already paid hers in full," Jamie announced proudly, tapping Carol's shoulder. "She deserves it." Susan nodded and added, "And unfortunately we cannot help you, Tessa. You know things are tight." Tessa remembered asking quietly, even a small amount would help. But Susan sighed and said, "College is expensive. You should look into cheaper options." Carol laughed lightly. "Or just take a break. School isn't for everyone." That sentence burned deeper than they ever imagined. They had no idea Tessa had been working 2 jobs, studying at night and carrying the weight of every bill on her own. They had no idea the rejection became her fuel. Tessa discovered the truth by accident a week after that dinner. She overheard Susan bragging on the phone that they had saved tens of thousands of dollars for Carol's education and planned to help her get a new apartment after graduation. "Tessa will be fine," Susan said casually. "She survives on little." Tessa stopped in the hallway, the words hitting her like cold rain. It wasn't about tight finances. It was about priority, Carol first always. That night, Tessa sat on her bed with her laptop open, staring at the email that had arrived hours earlier from the university. She had been selected as valedictorian. She had earned a full scholarship. She had done everything alone. And for the first time in her life she realized something important. Her family did not get to define her value anymore. Instead of confronting them, she made a decision. She would let them walk confidently into the moment they believed belonged to Carol. She would let them brag, let them mock her subtle successes, let them tell every aunt and uncle that Carol was the star. Quietly she gathered her proof, the screenshots of every tuition payment she had made, the email confirming her full scholarship, the work-study hours she completed, even the message from her dean praising her discipline. She printed them and sealed them in a simple envelope. Then she waited, calm and steady, just the way she had learned to survive. When the university announced that the valedictorian would give a short personal message before the official speech, she knew the moment had arrived. And now, standing on stage, she finally let herself breathe. Tessa let the applause fade before she continued, her eyes scanning the rows of guests dressed in bright colors and proud smiles. On the surface, graduation was a celebration of achievement, but for Tessa, it was a stage built for the truth. "People often say support shapes success," she began gently, "and for some people that is true." She glanced at Carol, who was whispering to Susan with an amused grin, already assuming Tessa would thank her. Tessa's fingers brushed the envelope, feeling the weight of every ignored moment. "But sometimes," she added, "success is built quietly in the dark where no one sees you." The room stilled. Even Jamie lifted his head. Tessa could sense the curiosity spreading through the hall, a slow-growing hush that pressed closer with every second. She took a breath, ready to take the next step. 3 weeks before graduation, Carol had strutted into the family living room wearing a new designer coat, one she proudly announced Susan bought for her. "A reward for my hard work," Carol said, tossing her hair. She turned to Tessa. What about you? Still juggling jobs? Jamie laughed and said, she tries. That's what matters. Susan added softly, not everyone can be academic. Don't pressure yourself. Tessa had stood there, smiling politely, even though the words sliced deeper than they realized. She remembered thinking if only they knew what I've been carrying. But she kept her secret. She let them believe she struggled. She let them feed Carol's ego. That night she tucked away another screenshot into her folder. She wasn't collecting revenge. She was collecting truth. And truth was patient. Back on the stage, Tessa gently opened the envelope. The sound of the paper rip echoed louder than expected, drawing every eye toward her hands. I want to share something personal today, she said. Not to embarrass anyone but to explain how I got here. Carol shifted uncomfortably. Susan frowned. Jamie leaned forward with narrowed eyes. Tessa held up the first printed page facing the audience. These, she said calmly, are the receipts of every tuition payment I made myself for the last 4 years. Every semester. Every book. Every fee. A low murmur swept through the hall. Some gasped softly. Others turned to look at her family. Tessa didn't rush. She laid the paper flat on the podium, her movements steady and controlled. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the moment people realized something wasn't adding up. Carol blinked rapidly, whispering loudly, "What is she doing?" Susan nudged her to stay quiet, though her face had already gone pale. Jamie cleared his throat, trying to maintain his usual confidence as guests near them glanced over. Tessa continued, her voice gentle but firm. My family believed I struggled academically, she said. They believed I needed reminders to do better. They believed I was the child who needed to settle for less. She paused. Silence spread like wildfire. But what they didn't know, she added, placing the second document on the podium, was that I earned a full scholarship because of my grades. And I never told them. A collective gasp filled the hall. Someone whispered, "Wait, what?" Another murmured, "She paid everything herself?" Tessa kept her eyes forward. She had waited years for this exact breath of honesty. The dean, standing behind her, adjusted his glasses and looked impressed, almost proud. He stepped slightly closer as if giving quiet support. Tessa continued speaking, her tone warm but unshakable. I stayed silent because I believed love meant patience, she said. I believed loyalty meant enduring things quietly. I believed my worth was something I had to earn in secret. She let the words fall softly like snow on a still night. But today, she added, I want the truth to breathe. Carol crossed her arms tightly. She's exaggerating, she muttered, earning a few surprised side glances. Susan forced a shaky smile, the kind of smile people wear when their mask begins to crack. Tessa looked directly at them, not with anger but with clarity. Everything I built, she said, I built alone. The audience waited, stunned and silent. Tessa reached for the third page inside the envelope, her fingers moving with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment silently for weeks. This, she said, lifting the document slightly, is the letter from the university notifying me of my scholarship renewal every year. She placed it gently beside the others. The dean nodded subtly, confirming its authenticity. Murmurs grew louder now, spreading through the rows like ripples. Carol sat stiff, blinking as if the lights were suddenly too bright. Jamie tried to force a laugh, the uneasy kind that begged people not to look too closely. Susan adjusted her necklace, her hand trembling. Tessa took her time, letting the crowd absorb everything. She wasn't here for revenge that screamed. She was here for truth that echoed. And the truth was doing exactly that. 4 months earlier, Carol had thrown a small party at the house to celebrate passing her midterm exams. She stood in the center of the living room with a drink in her hand, bragging loudly. Mom and Dad always knew I'd be the one to shine, she said. Guests laughed politely. Then she pointed at Tessa, adding, she's sweet but she's never been strong academically. Some people just don't have the brain for pressure. The room had gone quiet for a split second, but Carol didn't notice. Jamie clapped her back proudly. That's my girl, he said. Susan nodded as if the words were facts carved in stone. Tessa remembered standing by the window, pretending the comment didn't sting, pretending she didn't hear every whisper. She walked away then, but she didn't forget. Their arrogance wrote today's script. On stage, Tessa held up a small stack of printed screenshots. These, she said, are messages I sent to my parents asking for even a small amount of help when work hours became overwhelming. She placed them down slowly. This one, she continued, tapping a page lightly, is where I asked for just a little support for books during my second year. The audience leaned in. And this, she added, lifting another page, is the reply I received. We are tight on money. Focus on cheaper options. A stunned hush fell across the hall. Tessa looked directly at her family. But the truth, she said calmly, is that they paid every fee for my sister's education without hesitation. Gasps broke out. People exchanged looks. One woman mouthed, "Are you serious?" Carol's face turned crimson. Tessa didn't flinch. Jamie tried to stand, but Susan pulled him back down, whispering urgently, "Not here." But people near them had already begun to shift away, giving the family more space than before. Tessa continued, her voice steady. "I want to make something clear," she said. Needing help wasn't the issue. Being denied help wasn't the issue either. The issue was being told I wasn't worth investing in. She let the sentence hang for a moment. Yet somehow, she added, I managed to graduate at the top of my class. A few students clapped instinctively before stopping, unsure if applause was appropriate. The dean gave a small nod, encouraging them. Tessa looked back at her parents. "I wasn't the weak one," she said softly. "I was the one you never bothered to see." Carol suddenly stood up, pointing a shaky finger toward the stage. "This is ridiculous," she said loudly. "You're making us look bad for no reason." People turned toward her, eyebrows raised. Tessa didn't react. Instead, she spoke calmly into the microphone. "I'm not here to make anyone look bad," she said. "I'm here to explain how I got here. And I'm here to stop carrying stories that were never mine." Carol scoffed. "You're twisting things," she snapped. Jamie hissed, "Sit down, Carol," but the damage was already unfolding. Guests whispered. Phones subtly lifted, capturing the meltdown. Susan covered her face with her hand. Tessa waited until the noise faded again. She never raised her voice. He never needed to. Truth was louder than anything Carol could say. The dean stepped forward slightly, giving Tessa space but also signaling that she had the floor. "Please continue," he said warmly. Tessa nodded. She reached for the last document, the one she had held closest to her chest. "This," she said softly, "is the email from the dean himself informing me that I would be honored as valedictorian." She lifted it high enough for the audience to see the heading. "I received this months ago. And I chose not to share it." Susan gasped audibly, unable to hide her shock. Jamie stared at the ground, his hands tightly clasped. Carol's lips parted but no sound came out. The audience murmured as reality landed. The family didn't even know their daughter was the top graduate. Tessa placed the final page down and stood tall. "Why didn't you tell us?" Jamie finally shouted from the front row, unable to hold his composure. Whispers exploded instantly. Tessa looked at him with a calm expression, the kind born from years of being dismissed. "Because," she said gently, "you never asked." The hall went silent again. "Every conversation we had," she continued, "was about Carol. Her tests. Her classes. Her successes." She shook her head softly. "You didn't once ask how I was doing. You didn't once ask what I was working toward." Jamie opened his mouth but nothing came out. Tessa added, "I learned not to expect interest from people who only see what they want to see." The audience reacted with a mixture of gasps and nods. It was the kind of line that settles deep and stays there. Susan finally stood, her voice trembling. "Tessa, sweetheart, you're embarrassing yourself," she said. The room stiffened. Tessa blinked once, slowly. "No," she replied calmly. "I'm revealing myself." She turned toward the audience. "For years, my value in my own home was determined by how well I could stay out of the way. I learned to shrink myself so my sister's light could shine." Carol muttered, "You're so dramatic," under her breath, but the microphones picked it up. Several people turned toward her with disapproving looks. Tessa continued, "But shrinking doesn't make you kinder. It makes you invisible. And I refuse to be invisible anymore." Silence followed, thick and unbroken. Even the dean looked emotional. Tessa stepped slightly forward, letting the podium rest behind her. This stage was never meant to expose anyone, she said. But it has become the place where I finally speak. She looked at her documents, lined neatly in front of her like chapters of a story she once hid. I grew up believing I was lesser, she continued. But every night shift, every textbook I bought with my own earnings, every hour of studying alone taught me something different. The audience leaned in, drawn to her quiet strength. I did not rise in spite of being overlooked, she said. I rose because I learned not to rely on people who only love their favorite child. A few people clapped, unable to contain themselves. Tessa let them. Carol stood again, her voice sharp with panic. This is unfair. You're twisting everything. You're making us look like monsters. Her voice cracked, drawing more attention than she intended. Tessa looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, I don't need to make you look like anything. Your actions already painted the picture. The hall erupted into soft gasps. Carol froze, trembling. Jamie reached for her arm, but she pulled away. Susan stared at the documents, her face drained of color. Tessa returned her gaze to the audience. Every family has a truth, she said. This one is mine. She gave a small nod, signaling she was not finished. Not yet. The crowd waited, breath held. The dean gently stepped closer, sensing the tension tightening like a rope across the stage. Miss Morgan, he said softly, you have the right to share your journey. Your achievement is remarkable. His support only deepened the silence across the hall. Tessa nodded, grateful but still steady. She picked up the stack of documents one last time. These papers, she said, are not here to shame anyone. They are here to remind me, and maybe someone else out there, that success does not require validation from people who refuse to see you. She took a slow breath. I stood alone for years. But today I get to stand seen. The audience absorbed her words like a truth they didn't know they needed. Jamie covered his face. Susan looked down. Carol trembled with fury. Tessa remained unshaken. Trying to salvage control, Jamie stood abruptly, forcing a smile. She's exaggerating, he announced to the crowd. We love both our daughters equally. But the words landed flat, hollow, unconvincing. People whispered. Some shook their heads. Others looked at Tessa with sympathy. Tessa lowered the microphone slightly. Dad, she said, love is not the same as attention. And it certainly isn't the same as investment. A ripple of agreement moved through the audience. Jamie's face turned red, not from anger, but from the realization that people had seen through the act. You're making this look worse, Susan whispered harshly, pulling at his arm. But the damage had already spread. Their image cracked in real time, right in front of the very crowd they wanted to impress. Carol's voice finally burst out again, shaky and desperate. You could have just talked to us privately. Why humiliate us? The desperation in her tone made the room uncomfortable. Tessa looked at her sister, really looked at her, and said softly, I spent 26 years trying to talk privately. I spent 26 years waiting to be heard. She paused. Silence was comfortable for you. Not for me. Carol opened her mouth, but no words came. Tessa didn't mock her. She didn't smirk. She simply let the truth sit between them. The audience saw it clearly. One sister who had lived in spotlight, and one who had survived in shadow until she built her own light. And today that light was bright enough to expose everything. Tessa stepped behind the podium again and reached for the microphone. I'll say one last thing, she said quietly. The hall leaned in. Every parent loves differently. But when favoritism is disguised as love, the child left behind learns to love themselves in silence. She looked at the crowd. I hope no one else has to grow up believing their worth is smaller than someone else's success. A tear slipped down Susan's cheek. Jamie stared at the floor, defeated. Carol folded her arms, but her face was crumbling. Tessa added, My success today is not a celebration of what I lacked. It is a celebration of what I built. The audience erupted into soft, respectful applause. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just sincere. The dean placed a hand over his heart and nodded at her. Thank you for your honesty, Miss Morgan, he said. You may continue your valedictorian speech whenever you are ready. But Tessa shook her head lightly. I think, she said, my speech has already been given. The hall murmured again, a whisper of admiration. Tessa closed the folder, gathered the documents, and stepped away from the microphone. She didn't need to say another word. Everything she carried had been placed on the table. Finally. The truth was free. And so was she. Carol slumped into her seat. Susan wiped her face. Jamie finally looked at his daughter with something unfamiliar. Something close to respect, though late and fragile. As Tessa descended the stage stairs, students reached out to touch her arm gently, offering quiet congratulations. One girl whispered, "Thank you. Someone needed to say that." A young man added, "You spoke for people like me." A professor stopped her to say, "Strength doesn't always shout." Today it stood tall. Tessa smiled humbly, unsure how to handle the sudden wave of support. Behind her, the dean returned to the podium to move the ceremony forward. But the atmosphere had shifted. People looked at Tessa like someone who had survived something enormous. And she had. She walked toward the aisle where her family sat. None of them moved. None tried to stop her. None tried to make excuses. For the first time, the silence belonged to them, not her. When she reached their row, Tessa paused. Not to argue. Not to comfort. Not to explain. She simply said, "I hope someday we can talk honestly. But today isn't that day." Jamie opened his mouth, but Tessa gently shook her head. "Not now." Susan whispered, "We didn't know." But Tessa replied softly, "You didn't ask." Carol stared straight ahead, cheeks burning. A few people around them avoided eye contact, sensing the rawness of the moment. Then Tessa stepped past them, leaving the row without looking back. She didn't need applause or validation. She wasn't running away. She was simply walking toward a future where her worth wasn't measured by anyone else's blindness. Outside the hall, the air felt crisp and clean, like the world had opened a window just for her. Graduates posed for pictures with caps and family members, laughter filling the courtyard. Tessa stepped aside, letting the sun hit her face. For the first time in years, she felt weightless. Her phone buzzed. Messages from classmates, professors, even people she barely knew. Words like bravery, inspiring, and thank you filled the screen. She smiled not because she needed praise but because she finally felt understood. She walked toward the fountain in the center of campus, sat down on the stone edge and breathed deeply. The world felt wide. And for once she felt centered in it. A few minutes later, the dean approached quietly and sat beside her. "You know," he said, "strength like yours doesn't come from achievement. It comes from surviving what others never saw." Tessa nodded, her eyes soft. "I didn't want to shame them," she said. "I just wanted to stop carrying the lie." The dean smiled gently. "You didn't expose them. You exposed the truth. There's a difference." She let those words settle. He added, "Your story will matter to more people than you know." And for the first time, Tessa believed it. The ache she had carried for years felt lighter. Not gone, but finally acknowledged. Finally shared with the world. Tessa rose from the fountain, smoothed her gown and looked back at the hall one last time. She didn't expect her family to run after her. She didn't expect apologies. She didn't expect sudden change. And she didn't need any of it. She had spoken. She had stood. She had freed herself from the quiet that once buried her. As she walked across campus, the sun warm on her shoulders, she whispered to herself, "I am enough." And for the first time it felt true. Her family would face their own reflection now. She would face her future. Calmly. Powerfully. With her head held high.